I want to start by asking a big question, which would be, why study Trotsky at all? And I think for us as revolutionaries, the primary reason to study Trotsky is that studying Trotsky allows us to rescue Marxism and revolutionary socialism from the dire reputation that Stalin and the Soviet Union gave it. The purges, the gulag, economic failures, stifling of artistic action and activity, and so on. And as I will argue today, Trotsky offered not just a very real alternative to Stalin, but a fundamentally different and more democratic vision of socialism and for socialism in the 20th century, but also beyond. But that is not all. There were many revolutionaries in the USSR and the international labor movement who opposed the rise of Stalin and Stalinism. But what was special about Trotsky was that he had a unique angle from which to defend the legacies of socialism from below, as expressed by the October Revolution in 1917. He was no less than the co-leader of the Bolsheviks and the October Revolution with Lenin. And although Trotsky and Lenin had famously disagreed for much of the period before that revolutionary year, they in fact joined forces in 1917. I would say Lenin tended increasingly to disagree with his fellow old Bolsheviks, people who had been in the party for a very long time with him. And he began to side with Leon Trotsky on some very key questions. Most spectacularly, I'll argue, Lenin berated his closest lieutenants, Zinoviev and Kamenev, who opposed the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917. He opposed them also when they stayed in the Bolshevik party, but tried to argue for a coalition and unity with the socialists who had opposed taking power in October, so the Mensheviks and a large chunk of the socialist revolutionaries. If Trotsky had been the main proponent of unity between different socialist groups before 1917, he clearly had come around to Lenin's view that revolutionaries and reformists should not be in the same party in 1917. Lenin acknowledged this shift, and I'll just quote from him when he says that Trotsky long ago said the unification with the reformist socialists is impossible. Trotsky understood this, and from that time on, there has been no better Bolshevik. Here we see Lenin explicitly acknowledging that Trotsky had in effect accepted he had been wrong before about the Revolutionary Party. But he was also explicitly arguing that Trotsky had become the main proponent of Bolshevism and the idea of a revolutionary organization. This is extremely important in opposing the argument against building a revolutionary party on the Bolshevik model. This argument rests or assumes that Lenin led to Stalin. I mean, this is a general question that many of you might have encountered if you ever did GCSE, O-level, A-level Russian Revolution history. It's probably also just a popular argument in the movement. And there are different iterations of this argument, but it's based on a false assumption that Lenin's insistence on organizing the most militant, class-conscious workers in a party was somehow elitist and would lead to a dictatorship of the party over the working class. But as we will see, as I will argue today, Trotsky's opposition to Stalin is concrete proof that Bolshevism did not need to lead to Stalinism. It is proof, in fact, that the anarchist Victor Serge, who supported the Bolsheviks in the ensuing civil war after they took power in 1917, was right when he said, and I'm going to quote again, "It is often said that the germ of Stalinism was in Bolshevism at its beginning. Well, I have no objection. Only Bolshevism also contained many other germs, a mass of other germs, and those who lived through the enthusiasm of the first years of the victorious socialist revolution ought not to forget it." In all, therefore, standing in Trotsky's defense of his subsequent struggle against Stalin in the 1920s and 1930s is a way of defending the model of party that led to the main successful revolutionary seizure of power that we saw by the proletariat in the 20th century, or arguably even the only one. Throughout his struggle against Stalin in that time, Trotsky never gave up the idea of building a revolutionary party, the class-conscious militant minority of the class, whose task it was to win the majority of workers to revolutionary politics, as had happened in the course of 1917. Implicit in the formulation of the revolutionary party I've just proposed is fidelity to the spirit of Marx and Engels when they wrote in the Communist Manifesto. I'm going to quote again, not just because it's a great quotation or to prove that Marx and Engels were also right, but that indeed there is a kind of spirit of this in earlier communist writing. This is from the Communist Manifesto. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. First, in the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out, communists point out, and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. It's a bit of a lengthy quotation, but I'm going to carry on. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all the others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. So put differently, Marx and Engels saw the need for a separate party of revolutionaries, but one that fought for the maximum unity of the working class in struggle, and the notion ultimately that the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, as Marx put it in the program of the First Communist International. Now, I will argue today that Trotsky's struggle against Stalinism was a defense of that view of the party as one ultimately linked to the revolutionary self-emancipation of the international working class. And I will go on to demonstrate this for the rest of my presentation, almost 10 minutes in. I finally am getting to Trotsky's struggle against Stalinism. Almost. So I just want to very briefly talk about Trotsky's understanding of the Russian Revolution. I believe this was to some extent already dealt with in the first session of this series by Faizi Ismail, when she talked about Trotsky and the developing world, but bear with me. I think Trotsky had a very clear view of the Russian Revolution as part of a world process of revolution. And to briefly summarize for those who weren't there for Faizi's talk, Trotsky acknowledged just after the 1905 revolution in Russia that Russia, looked at in isolation from the rest of the world, was not ready for a socialist revolution. It had a small section of its population based in cities, and even smaller proportion of that population was working class. The working class was an island in a sea of rural backwardness. The country was ruled by a state with roots in feudal absolutism. There was no democratic organization allowed before 1905. The Tsar was an absolutist autocratic ruler, and so on. However, Trotsky places Russia in an international setting, and what he says is, when we look at Russia from the perspective of the world's economy, from the perspective of the global, what you see is a country furiously trying to industrialize to compete internationally with its big power rivals. And Russia's workers labored in what may be described as imported islands of modernity in this sea of backwardness. As such, they were in effect linked with and part and parcel of the modern working class globally. The local bourgeoisie in Russia was too weak to modernize Russia or even to challenge Tsarist autocracy, because they were too fearful that mobilizing the mass of the people behind them would lead to property challenges to private property in themselves. So they tended to side with the Tsarist autocracy and hoped for a kind of authoritarian modernization. So there was going to be no democratic revolution coming from the bourgeoisie. In fact, it was the working class that would have to pose this question of democracy, but it would then, in doing so, also pose and go over from democratic to socialist revolution. In the process, this would be the starting bang of a world revolution. So the Russian Revolution would in fact be part of a global process of what may be called permanent revolution. Now, Trotsky's theory, which he termed uneven and combined development and permanent revolution arising out of that, was in many ways borne out in the period 1917 to about 1923 in Europe. Revolution did indeed spread from Russia westwards after the Bolsheviks seized power and as the First World War drew to a close. At this time, although Lenin and Trotsky both agreed that the Russian Revolution was merely the parting shot of European and world revolution, they would see themselves in they would find themselves rather in a minority in Russia about how world revolution was to be achieved, or how socialism globally was going to be achieved. That's what I'm going to concentrate on a bit, and we'll get to Stalin, I hope, very soon. Lenin's and Trotsky's disagreements with leading Bolsheviks expressed themselves both in terms of how the revolution would be spread abroad and how socialism would be built in Russia itself. In Central Europe, there were several Soviet republics formed in the Bavarian lands of Germany, in Hungary, and so on, but these were very short-lasting, a couple of months in the Hungarian case. And as these fell, it became clear that a major problem for revolutionaries in Europe, unlike that in Russia, was that a major revolutionary party like the Bolshevik Party was missing. It had not been built in advance of the revolution. And this was proving to be an obstacle in terms of both achieving power and also retaining it. Leading old Bolsheviks like Zinoviev, who we've mentioned before, one of Lenin's long-standing lieutenants, and the leading light of the Communist International, which was a coordinator of world communism from Moscow, argued for effectively minority revolutionary action by the communist parties going on the offensive, even as the revolutionary wave was ebbing in Europe. By contrast, Lenin and Trotsky argued that the working class was now in a defensive position. It had to defend the gains of the working class movement, and that minority action in this context would not work. Instead, they argued for the United Front method. Okay, so you might have heard a bit more about this in the second part of the series on Trotsky by Counterfire by Martin Hall. In his talk, he gave an excellent overview of this. I cannot go into the same amount of detail, but I'll try to link it to my overall argument about working class unity across borders. The basic proposition that Lenin and Trotsky put to the revolutionary parties, based on their own experience in Russia, was that revolutionary parties should work with reformist parties to defend workers' conditions. But then also in the process, revolutionaries would show through their superior tactics that joining revolutionary parties was better than joining reformist parties. And thereby, in the process of the struggle, they would win over sections of the working class until they had a majority for a revolutionary takeover of power. Right, so clearly there was a precondition for a revolutionary party for the United Front to exist, but the revolutionary party had to hope to attain the broadest and the most militant unity of the whole class in order to contest for state power in the last analysis. Now, the Comintern ultimately did adopt this approach that Lenin and Trotsky proposed, but it only did so really superficially. and very much late in the day, around 1923, which did not allow the communist parties to reverse the ebbing of the post-revolutionary wave. I don't have time to go into this, but it pretty much ended with the failure of the German communists in October 1923 to win power. Domestically too, there were major controversies about the way forward. Ever more isolated internationally, having fought a civil war against opponents who had the backing of the major imperialist powers, the Bolsheviks inherited and ruled over a devastated country. The democratic flowering of workers' Soviets and democracy and workers' power in 1917 had been channeled into the creation of the Red Army to defeat the White Armies in the counter-revolution on the military front. But once this had been achieved by about 1921, how to proceed, how to build socialism in this devastated and increasingly isolated country. Lenin himself, the leader of the Bolsheviks, was worried, and he argued that the Bolsheviks were running a state, the Russian state, which was still the old Tsarist state apparatus, as he put it, anointed with Soviet oil. Lenin worried that the proletarian party was being corrupted by ruling through this mechanism and over a backward country. He finally worried that the person who was accumulating power within the party as the general secretary, who could appoint people to positions of power, was using and abusing his power undemocratically. We are now finally talking about Joseph Stalin, who had become the general secretary and was exhibiting worrying traits. One of these was that despite being a Georgian himself, Stalin was beginning to act like a great Russian chauvinist of the Tsarist past. He, for example, dismissed the entire Georgian government as part of the Soviet Federation and imposed one from Moscow, largely with Russian cronies in their place. Already dying, Lenin was very much in his final days already from the end of 1922 until he died in early 1924. Lenin, from his deathbed, effectively joined forces with Trotsky to oppose Stalin in this particular instance, but also more generally, he wanted to remove Stalin from his position as general secretary. He even wrote in his will that he felt that Stalin was not the right character to wield such great amounts of power. He called for him to be removed. That did not happen. As it happened, Stalin successfully suppressed that document, and that's a story in itself. You can read more about it in Moshe Lewin's book, Lenin's Last Struggle. But when Lenin died in 1924, the old Bolsheviks, who I have described, closed ranks to shut Trotsky as the kind of heir apparent out of power. They viewed him as far too powerful. He was head of the Red Army and co-leader of the October insurrection. So quite clearly he was seen as a front runner to take over. So they pacted to stop him. I won't get into the ins and outs of the power struggle of the 1920s. That's a complicated story, and you could read more about it. But what I want to kind of talk about is and contrast is Stalin's positions in the power struggle and contrast them with those of Leon Trotsky. So Stalin formulated a policy which would effectively justify his growing power and the growing undemocratic behavior of the party ruling the kind of Tsarist state, in effect. If world revolution was ebbing, if permanent revolution was not happening, for him that was fine. It could be postponed. Instead, according to his theory, the world proletariat was better served if the Soviet Union went on to isolate itself and build socialism in one country. And this was seen as a kind of, or presented as an optimistic vision. Russia's a big country, we can build socialism And postponing world revolution, that's okay. The revolution is better served by us building socialism at home. So this postponement of world revolution became something of a permanent postponement, the permanently postponed revolution. Right. Now, Stalin from that point on zigzagged in terms of policies. In fact, he zigzagged from policy disaster, you could say, to policy disaster. The logic of this can only be, or his policies and his zigzagging can only be understood if it is seen as a strategy of consolidating power for that undemocratic state bureaucracy that he was now ruling, and maintaining its grip on power against the working class and the population of Russia as a whole. Working class standards and rights domestically in the 1920s were increasingly eroded and subordinated to the needs of this party state. That's domestically, and abroad, the United Front method kept being redefined out of all recognition in comparison with the definition I had given you a bit earlier. I take it I've been talking for about 20 minutes, is that right? Good, thank you. Okay, so very briefly then, in the 1920s, Stalin, backed by another old Bolshevik, Nikolai Bukharin, attacked Trotsky for being overly interested in workers and not caring enough for peasants. This was one of the obvious ways in which he was beginning to downgrade the working class in its importance for revolutionary activity. Domestically, he and Bukharin championed policies called the New Economic Policy that effectively would keep the peasants happy. I'm not going to get into the detail of it, but this was at the expense of the city and of the working class. And abroad, they championed what they called a united front, but that was effectively a cross-class alliance of what they called peasants and workers. Again, that was downgrading the workers. In for example, the Chinese Revolution, which around 1926-27 was reaching its peak. Both of these policies, both the NEP and this new version of the United Front, which was effectively a popular front, were turned out to be disasters. Domestically, the Soviet working class became restive, and the peasants began to feel powerful enough to resist the state. So they did things like often enough go on grain strikes, if I can put it this way. They wouldn't hand over a grain to the state. Abroad, especially in China, as I was saying, the United Front of peasants and workers turned out to essentially have subordinated the working class party, the Chinese communists in particular, to the peasant party, what might have been the SRs in the Russian case, the Socialist Revolutionaries, in this case, the Kuomintang Chinese nationalists, who in effect at some point at a key moment broke relations with the communists and turned on them, crushing the revolutionary upheaval of 1926-27 in China. Trotsky, on both of these counts, had resisted Stalin's policies and was being increasingly sidelined and repressed for doing so. However, because of the failure in both instances, Stalin had to change tack to stay in power. And so what he did was, by around 1928-29, he switched and began to attack the peasantry at home through forced collectivization and industrialization. This was in effect an all-out war against the Russian population through the so-called 5-year plans. And abroad, he moved to redefine the United Front again in a completely different direction, this time effectively redefining it as a Communist Party front. He also managed, around about this time, to expel Trotsky from the Communist Party and expel him from the Soviet Union. Trotsky would live as an outcast and an exile, pretty much permanently on the run, until he was killed by one of Stalin's agents in 1940. All this was, in effect, to no avail from Stalin's perspective. His policies once again proved unsuccessful, not to say disastrous. Trotsky was proved correct for resisting them. forced collectivization and industrialization was a failure, very obviously on a human standpoint. Millions died, but Stalin also was forced, because of the chaos in industry, to slow down his industrialization drive in the mid-1930s and effectively begin to apologize for having gone too far. But that was not enough. So he passed on from that to large-scale repression, the so-called purges, the terror, in which hundreds of thousands were executed and millions were forced into labor camps and so on. Similarly, abroad, his redefinition of the United Front once again prevented the unity of action between the communists and the social democrats, again in Germany, but this time with very high stakes indeed. Around about 1932 to 1933, his prevention of the collaboration of the two main working class parties effectively allowed Hitler's Nazis to take power. Trotsky, writing from abroad, wrote the most incredible fulminations against these policies. They're probably some of the most eloquent things written, especially on the history of fascism, and I encourage you to read them. And they were an eloquent reminder of how different history might have been had it not been Stalin running the Soviet Union, but someone like Trotsky. He warned very prophetically around 1932 that if the working class did not unite to stop Hitler, Hitler would crush them like a tank, basically. He would run over them and their skulls and like a tank. It's quite a horrific image, but it was very accurate. The Stalinists, of course, were almost gleeful when the Nazis won, because they said after the Nazis, us. That proved to be incorrect. So in the short term, in this story, Stalinism was triumphing over Trotskyism, if I can put it that way, over Trotsky. But Stalin's policies proved to be quite catastrophic. In response to the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union once again pressed hard to industrialize at home and formed cross-class alliances abroad. This proved in some ways popular in the ostensible fight against fascism, but what it did was also curtail revolutionary movements in France and Spain. I don't have time to go into that. From the Soviet perspective, ultimately these popular fronts proved successful in the sense that the Red Army ultimately triumphed over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And this was seen at the time widely as some kind of vindication of Stalin's policies. However, in the long run, that would not be the case. So let me just see how much time I've got. Yeah, I'll try to start wrapping up. But Trotsky made a lot of predictions about Stalinism, and in the short term, he proved incorrect about it. So in the short term, the Soviet Union emerged from the Second World War looking more powerful. Trotsky had expected a revolutionary crisis in the Soviet Union. Many states and anti-colonial movements in the Cold War looked to the USSR for leadership against the United States in a way that blocked the permanent revolution notion that Trotsky had spoken about and had predicted. And socialism from below for a long time disappeared as a force in world politics in attempts at modeling the Soviet developmental model. But in reality, this monstrous system fed off exploitation and led to major eruptions of working class discontent repeatedly, perhaps famously in Hungary in 1956 with the rise of the Solidarity trade union in 1980. And it was these working class movements that contributed in a major way to the collapse of the Stalinist system in 1989. But over time, workers had begun to desert the communist parties, but also the social democratic parties in East and West from the late 1960s on. And some militant workers began to look for guidance to Trotsky's writings, who, despite being wrong in some of his short-term predictions, in the spirit of what he was saying, proved to be quite prophetic. And especially so after 1989. I think I'll conclude by simply saying and reiterating that the failure of Stalinism in the 20th century is a vindication of Trotsky's struggle for revolution, for world revolution, and from self-emancipation, for self-emancipation of the working class. And many of his polemics, I think, are relevant today, perhaps even more so than, more obviously so than they were in the last 20 to 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the rise of China as a global economic power, a lot of people on the left and not just in Britain look to China as an alternative. I think if we look at Trotsky and some of his followers like Tony Cliff, we'll find that actually looking to a state like China is not the way for us to go. But it's also a way of preventing revolutionaries falling into mistakes like tailing other parties, and in particular other classes, and creating cross-class alliances. It's looking to Trotsky is in many ways a good way of arguing against things like the electoral pacts that were discussed between Labour and the Liberal Democrats under Corbyn and so on. And in effect, to argue in favour of the self-emancipation of the working class as the main vehicle to achieve change, but also the need for a revolutionary party in order to give the workers that kind of confidence that is needed and the organisation that is needed to win. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.